In 1942, Japanese General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, conquered Singapore in 70 days and humiliated the British Empire in one of history's largest military surrenders. 3 years later, the Americans hanged him for a massacre he may not even have known was taking place. How did one of the Second World War's greatest strategists meet such a downfall? Was it justice or revenge? Stay with me until the end, because the Tiger of Malaya's body ended up somewhere no one expected. By 1941, Japan was an expansionist power with a voracious appetite for territory. After conquering much of China during the 1930s, Imperial Japan had set its sights on Southeast Asia, a region rich in oil, rubber, and minerals, precisely the resources its war machine needed to keep running. It was against this backdrop that General Tomoyuki Yamashita entered the picture. Born on November 8, 1885, in a small village in Japan's Kochi Prefecture, Yamashita was the son of a country doctor. He chose a military career at an early age and, over the decades, built a reputation as a meticulous, disciplined, and technically brilliant officer. But it was in December 1941, with the attack on Pearl Harbor still fresh in the world's memory, that Yamashita had the chance to prove what he could do. On December 8, 1941, just hours after the attack on Hawaii, he was ordered to invade Malaya, then a British colony. The mission seemed impossible. The British had tens of thousands of troops, powerful naval bases, and Singapore, which Winston Churchill himself considered an impregnable fortress. But Yamashita had a plan unlike anything the military world had seen before: the impossible conquest of Malaya. Rather than advance by sea, where British artillery was concentrated, Yamashita did the unexpected. He ordered his men through the jungle. With around 30,000 frontline troops, he attacked from the north, crossing the Thai border and driving down the Malay Peninsula. His forces cut through dense jungle, using bicycles to conserve energy and maintain their rapid pace. Bicycles. You read that right. While the British waited for an invasion from the sea, the Japanese were already in the jungle, bypassing defenses, seizing strategic positions, and cutting supply lines. The operation combined speed, deception, and brutality. A campaign expected to last months was over in just 70 days. And then came the moment that went down in history. On February 15, 1942, British General Arthur Percival found himself facing a desperate situation. His troops were surrounded in Singapore. Supplies were running out. With no way out, he requested a meeting with Yamashita. The two men met at a Ford factory on the outskirts of Singapore. What happened at that meeting was captured in photographs that were seen around the world. Yamashita, imposing and immaculate in his uniform, looked directly at Percival and asked just one question in a firm, direct voice: yes or no? He wanted an immediate surrender with no negotiations. Percival, pale-faced, signed. About 85,000 British, Australian, and Indian troops surrendered that day. It was the largest military capitulation in the history of the British Empire. Churchill called it the greatest disaster and the greatest surrender in British history. And it was this victory that earned Yamashita the nickname he would carry for the rest of his life: the Tiger of Malaya. In Japan, he became a national hero. His photograph appeared in the newspapers. Children knew his name. But there was one detail we cannot ignore. As the Malayan campaign unfolded, a terrible atrocity was recorded along the way. On February 14, 1942, one day before the formal surrender, Japanese soldiers stormed Alexandra Hospital in Singapore. They killed doctors, nurses, and patients, including people on the operating table. Hundreds of civilians and military personnel who had surrendered were killed. Yamashita would later claim that he had never ordered the massacre and did not know it was happening. Decades later, that claim would become the central issue in one of the most controversial trials in history: the fall of the Tiger and the Manila Massacre. After the conquest of Malaya, something curious happened to Yamashita. Instead of receiving further major assignments, he was sent to Manchuria, a remote region far from the main battlefronts. For 2 full years he remained there, all but forgotten. Why? The story goes that General Hideki Tojo, then Japan's prime minister, was jealous of Yamashita. He feared that the popularity of the Tiger of Malaya might politically eclipse him. So Yamashita was sent away to the bitter cold of Manchuria, far from the spotlight. But in October 1944, with the war turning against Japan on every front, Yamashita was recalled for a desperate mission: to defend the Philippines. This is where the story becomes even more complex. When Yamashita arrived, he found total chaos. More than 250,000 Japanese troops were scattered across the archipelago, but most were under other officers who did not answer directly to him. Communications had collapsed. American forces, led by General Douglas MacArthur, were advancing in full force. The Japanese troops were disoriented, starving, and cut off from supplies. Yamashita made a decision: abandon Manila, the capital, and concentrate his forces in the mountains, away from the city. He knew that fighting in a densely populated city would be disastrous, both militarily and in humanitarian terms. But another Japanese admiral, Sanji Iwabuchi, did not follow that order. Iwabuchi decided to defend Manila with about 17,000 men, including sailors and army personnel, even without Yamashita's authorization. What happened between February and March of 1945 went down in history as one of the greatest atrocities of the Second World War. During the Battle of Manila, Iwabuchi's sailors carried out a systematic massacre of Filipino civilians. Men, women, and children were executed en masse in the streets. Prisoners of war were murdered. Hospitals were attacked. Entire neighborhoods were set on fire with people still inside. An estimated 100,000 to 150,000 Filipino civilians died during those weeks of horror. Yamashita was in the mountains, isolated and unable to communicate with Iwabuchi. When the Americans finally captured Manila, they found a destroyed city and began looking for someone to blame. Yamashita formally surrendered on September 2, 1945, the same day Japan signed its official surrender aboard the American ship USS Missouri. He descended from his positions in the mountains of Kiangan and handed his sword to General Jonathan Wainwright, bringing his resistance to an end. Months later, he was sitting in the dock, the trial that divided the legal world. Yamashita's trial began in Manila on October 29, 1945. From the very first day, serious questions were raised about how the proceedings were being conducted. The American military tribunal was chaired by General Wilhelm D. Steyr. None of its 5 judges had any legal training. Yamashita was given very little time to prepare his defense, while the American press was already reporting the case as though his conviction were certain. The central charge was that Yamashita had failed to control troops who committed atrocities against civilians. As their commander, the prosecution argued, he should therefore be held responsible. But there was a major flaw in that reasoning. Yamashita's defense lawyers, including American officers assigned to represent him who came to believe sincerely in his cause, presented evidence that he had been physically cut off from Manila during the massacre, that he had no knowledge of what Sanji Iwabuchi was doing, that he had never ordered the massacre, and that he had, in fact, tried to send withdrawal orders that never got through. The defense argued that a man could not be convicted for crimes he did not know were taking place and could not have prevented. The prosecution, however, maintained that whether he knew was irrelevant. As commander, it was his responsibility to know. Because he had failed to act to prevent the atrocities, he was guilty. The trial lasted just over a month, and on December 7, 1945, exactly 4 years after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, a date the Americans had obviously not forgotten, the verdict was announced. Guilty. The sentence? Death by hanging. The defense lawyers' last resort was to appeal to the Supreme Court of the United States. They argued that the tribunal lacked legitimacy and that the proceedings violated the basic guarantees of a fair trial. By a vote of 6-2, the Supreme Court rejected the appeal. 2 justices, however, wrote dissenting opinions that would become famous in the history of international law. Justices Frank Murphy and Wiley Rutledge stated plainly that Yamashita was being condemned without proof that he had known about the crimes or could have prevented them. Murphy argued that the proceedings violated due process and that the accused was being condemned to satisfy a desire for revenge. And so Douglas MacArthur's name entered this history in a way few had expected. After the Supreme Court rejected the appeal, Yamashita's case came before MacArthur, who had the authority to review the sentence. MacArthur had waged a personal battle against the Japanese for the Philippines for years. He had been driven out of Manila in 1942 and had promised, "I shall return." He reviewed the case and confirmed the death sentence. Yamashita's lawyers then appealed to United States President Harry Truman for clemency. Truman declined to intervene. Was there a personal element to MacArthur's decision? Many historians believe there was. MacArthur and Yamashita had stood on opposite sides of a brutal war, and the loss of the Philippines had been one of the greatest humiliations of MacArthur's career. Before we continue, we want to make sure you are following along and enjoying the story. Leave a comment saying, "I want more stories." It only takes a moment, helps more people discover the video, and your comment may even be pinned to show that you were here. The final days and the execution. Yamashita was held in a cell in Manila while his lawyers fought his appeals. In the final days before his execution, he wrote letters to his wife, to his children, and to the soldiers who had fought alongside him. According to records from the time, he was calm and showed no sign of despair. He spent hours meditating and refused any form of clemency that might have appeared to be a confession to something he insisted he had not done. There was also a detail about those final days that few people know. Shortly before the execution, Yamashita dictated his final words to a Buddhist chaplain named Morita Shokaku, who was responsible for recording everything. What he said surprised even his own lawyers. In private, away from the cameras and the rigid atmosphere of the courtroom, Yamashita acknowledged his failure as a commander. He said he regretted not having been able to discipline his troops and punish those who had committed crimes against the Filipino people. He asked the Japanese people to rebuild themselves after the war. He said he was a simple soldier, a man of few words, and that 1,000 emotions were overwhelming him in that final hour. This was a completely different Yamashita from the one the world had seen in court. On February 23, 1946, Tomoyuki Yamashita was taken to the execution site at the Los Baños camp in Laguna, about 48 kilometers south of Manila. It was still before dawn. On the personal orders of General Douglas MacArthur, he had been stripped of every decoration and insignia indicating his military rank. He wore only the plain uniform of a private soldier. A Buddhist priest walked beside him. He climbed the 13 steps to the gallows slowly, but with firm resolve. Before the execution, his final request was simple, that he be allowed to bow toward the palace of the Japanese emperor, a last reverence to his country. When asked whether he had any final statement, Yamashita replied through an interpreter in a low voice, "As I said before the Supreme Court of Manila, I did everything within my power. For that reason, when I die, I will feel no shame before the gods for what I have done." He concluded in a mixture of resignation and firmness, expressing gratitude for the treatment he had received from American officers during the trial. There was no long speech and no pleading. At 3 hours and 2 minutes in the morning, the trapdoor opened. The Tiger of Malaya fell. His body swung in the darkness for nearly 25 minutes before he was pronounced dead. He was 60 years old. Theories and the legal legacy. As with any historical event that appears controversial, interpretations emerge in abundance. Some argue that Yamashita was a war criminal who deserved the maximum punishment for what happened in the Philippines, regardless of whether he gave direct orders. They say command responsibility exists precisely for that reason, so military leaders cannot simply say, "I didn't know." That view carries weight. A general who controls an army cannot evade responsibility by claiming that communications had been cut off. But other scholars prefer a more grounded analysis. Researchers and legal experts who have studied the case in depth, including Frank Reel, one of the American lawyers who defended Yamashita and later wrote an entire book about the trial, argue that the proceedings were political. that the United States needed a symbol of Japanese defeat, and that Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, the man who had humiliated the British Empire in 1942, was the perfect symbol. And then came the most unexpected legacy of this entire story. Yamashita's trial gave rise to what became known in international law as the Yamashita Standard. In broad terms, the standard holds that a military commander can and should be held responsible for crimes committed by his troops, even if he did not directly order those crimes, when it is proven that he knew, or should have known, what was happening and failed to take measures to stop it. This principle is still applied in international courts today. It is incorporated into the Rome Statute, which established the International Criminal Court. It influenced trials involving the former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, and dozens of other cases in the decades that followed. So we are left with a deeply paradoxical situation, aren't we? A man many believe was judged unfairly left behind a legal legacy that still protects civilians around the world. And that raises a question with no easy answer. Is it possible for an individual injustice to produce a norm that benefits society as a whole? The mystery of Yamashita's treasure. Before we reach the end of this story, there is one detail that cannot be overlooked. The story of Yamashita even includes a mystery involving buried treasure. In the decades after the war, rumors spread that the Japanese had hidden an immense cache of gold, jewels, and artifacts in the Philippines, looted from Asian countries they had conquered during the conflict. This hidden hoard became known as Yamashita's treasure, or Yamashita's gold. Its value has been estimated at hundreds of billions of dollars. And in the 1970s, the story took a real, documented, and utterly bizarre turn. In January 1971, a humble Filipino locksmith named Rogelio Rojas, who hunted for treasure in his spare time, claimed to have found part of it. According to Rojas, after months of digging a tunnel near Baguio, his team uncovered skeletons wearing Japanese uniforms, samurai swords, rusty rifles, and a golden Buddha statue nearly a meter tall with a removable head. Inside the statue, Rojas claimed, were hidden rough diamonds. Nearby stood dozens of stacked boxes, each about the size of a beer crate, filled with gold bars. But a few months later, in April 1971, Rojas claimed that armed men supposedly linked to the government broke into his home and took away the golden Buddha and the gold bars. He said he was arrested and tortured and spent years trying to prove his story. And the man he named as responsible for all of it, Ferdinand Marcos himself, the president of the Philippines at the time. Decades later, in the 1990s, Rogelio Rojas's family sued Marcos and his wife, Imelda, in a U.S. court in Hawaii. The outcome shocked everyone. In 1996, a jury ordered the Marcos family to pay $22 billion in damages, at the time, the largest civil damages award ever granted in the United States. The amount was later reduced on appeal, but the case established an important precedent. In its ruling, the U.S. court recognized that Rogelio Rojas had found the Yamashita treasure and that Marcos's men had stolen it from him. Rojas, however, never saw a cent of that money. He died in 1993, before the trial had even ended, in circumstances that remain disputed to this day. Some say it was tuberculosis. Others insist he was murdered. To this day, people still travel to the Philippines in search of this treasure. Adventurers, researchers, and fortune hunters. Some claim to have found clues. Others have mysteriously disappeared during their searches. Serious historians, by and large, are skeptical that a large-scale treasure remains buried. They argue that much of the gold looted by the Japanese was lost aboard ships sunk by the Americans during the war, or never reached the Philippines at all. One Filipino historian even remarked that after more than 50 years of searching with maps, testimonies, and sophisticated metal detectors, no one had ever found concrete proof of a fortune on such a scale. But the mystery endures, continuing to fuel stories, books, and even films to this day. So, was the Tiger of Malaya a hero or a war criminal? The honest answer is, it depends on whom you ask. And perhaps that is exactly what makes Tomoyuki Yamashita's story so fascinating and so disturbing at the same time. There is no clearly right side and clearly wrong side. There are layers, politics, war, victor's justice, and legal principles that continue to protect lives to this day. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, do you think Yamashita was judged fairly? Thank you, as always, for your company. I'll see you in the next video. Until then.